Hey guys, WildOx Studios here, and today we're going to talk a little bit about VR development in Unreal Engine. So first and foremost, if you're coming into this new, you're going to be straddling the fence. Do I do UE5? Do I go UE4? Maybe you even jumped into UE5, and you're starting to realize like you're hitting that ceiling fast. Like you are running out of milliseconds to hit your full frames. 11 milliseconds is hard to squeeze under. Everybody knows that, especially in UE5. So I'm going to talk about 427's branch, and that's partially why. So right now I have a branch that is basically a clone of 427 with the Oculus SDK v62, and currently I also have it labeled as Android Fix, and this is due to a bunch of different things. I've went over this in previous videos, so I'm not going to cover this too much. Basically, there's a guide here that you can follow, and you can hold your tongue just right. I've kept it up to date as best as I can to keep you able to be pushing to the Oculus store with their fork. That means ES3 HDR is supported. You just can't have mobile multi-view enabled. It is the most versatile path at this moment to push to Quest 2 and Quest 3. And I do have to applaud them. I understand why they stayed with this version, because technically you can still push to the Quest 1 because you have ES3 support. So now, in Oculus Start, the question arose where it's like, well, what do we do if Oculus deprecates? Because they deprecated 29, 28 build targets. You have to target 32, and the only way you can do that now is if you go set these settings, and you also have to change the permission settings, add some tags, etc. Like all of this is here for you to follow, and I've covered that in a previous video. But what if they do it again? What if they deprecate again? And the good news is that 427 has a branch on Epic's repo called 427 Plus, and that 427 Plus is like basically the engine keeping up with requirements for consoles and Android development. And I'm glad that was there because like in some regard, developing on mobile and VR and UE5 has been pretty difficult. Like, yeah, there's been a few releases. Behemoth pulled off a technical marvel. Bravo to you guys. But for the most part, most of your really solid AAA experiences or AA experiences or even indie experiences are still going to be UE4. And there's a reason for that I'll get into in a second. But so if we go here, you'll see I have a 427 plus dash meta branch. And essentially what I've done is I've migrated the integration of the 194 plugin v62 over. And I've also detailed out like what this means. So if you through this process, I was able to go read the source code. I was able to see like what was touched and why when migrating this SDK over. And essentially like the branch itself, Epic has gotten 427 in parity with the Android requirements of say UE5, like JDK 17 and Android 34 are what is recommended. But because of this, the API on the Oculus side and OpenXR is like, hey, we can't support OpenGL anymore. So it's not really Oculus that did it. It's due to the requirements of the target build for OpenXR going, being built out to their API and moving that far up. And I have to applaud, Meta for keeping their official fork where they did. Because of this, ES3 is deprecated. Also in their updated API, they are using the Oculus platform, not the Oculus subsystem. So that's fully deprecated. You'll get warnings and errors if you build out going to a higher target. And with a higher build tool. You have to use Vulkan ARM. The editor preview does work with multi-view, mobile multi-view, but your shadows are going to look wonky. So I would recommend using ES3 preview there, but just don't package to it, package to Vulkan, or make sure you keep Vulkan enabled in your package if you want to use ES3 preview and editor. Vulkan plus MMV does work with dynamic shadows at runtime, but there is no HDR support in this build, and that's due to the fact that HDR only worked with ES3 in the older version of 4.27, and because ES3 is deprecated, well, you lose HDR. It would be amazing if you guys would want to look at the ES3.1 feature set and figure out how to get HDR working in Vulkan. That's a little beyond me. It's a pretty good lift to go review all of that code. I've put my eyeballs on USH there. There's basically like a if DX true and mobile multi-view enabled and instant stereo fallback path line for editor preview to determine how to handle shading and shadows versus like if you're in a HMD testing and PIE versus if you have Android preview enabled but you're on a DX device. It's pretty hairy, man. But yeah, any help here would be appreciative, because I do know that like even though this future-proofs us, if they deprecate the API and they move to a new SDK, or they push the target build of Android to upload to the store up anymore, this is it. This is the last line of defense we have on the 4.27. And you may be asking yourself, like, why care about this? Well, if UE5 was better or faster or more efficient for me to work within VR and mobile, I would be there. Like, plain and simple. That's the answer. I've tested it, I've used it, I've migrated projects to it. There's some blocker somewhere, and some of it is easier, I guess, explained than others. And if we talk about like optimization, UE5 markets themselves as being higher optimized, and a lot of people you hear their YouTube videos are like, it's killing gaming, this, that, and the other. Well, it's all a matter of perspective. If I threw 3 million triangles at a UE4.27 project, the exponential growth of the optimization curve is going to fall off drastically as you just start throwing objects into it. If you go on the UE5 and you do the same thing, it's going to do the same thing. However, you now have like nanite. In UE4.27, if you want to do something that you want to do in UE5, you don't have to just check a box. You have to go HLOD it out, build HLOD groups, like build LOD groups. You have a more manual process of optimizing there. However, you get what you pay for. In UE5, you're going to pay a huge upfront cost. You're going to pay additional costs for vertex, world position offsets. You're going to pay a huge upfront cost for software rasterization. You're going to pay a huge upfront cost just to have nanite enabled. And so if you throw 300 draws into a scene in UE4 and then you throw 300 draws in UE5 and you turn nanite on and you're like, whoa, wait, what just happened? Why is UE5 slower? Well, you got to have virtual shadow maps enabled. You got to have SM6 enabled. You got to have all these additional requirements just to be able to use the nanite tech. And that's what I mean by the overhead is more expensive, especially if you're only going to render 300 to 1,000 draws and you're going to be under 1 million triangles. You're paying more in UE5 for that. And what that means is that it's harder on mobile and VR mobile processors. Like, it's just harder. It's also the same thing is true with DX11 and DX12. Everybody's like, oh, well, DX12 is more efficient. It's more efficient. DX12 utilizes twice as much memory as DX11 on most occasions. And that's because it uses these power extensions that pre-cache things. And it's built around a high memory bandwidth subset. The underlying driver relies on a lot of memory and fast accessible memory. And unfortunately, a lot of the DX12 ready cards, quote unquote ready, your lower end 20 series, your higher end 10 series cards, they're DX11 cards. They're just called DX12 ready because they can do it, but they're not optimally set up to do that. They're lacking the memory bandwidth to be able to use those things efficiently. So if you run DX11 on the same game, have no changes to it, and we're doing SM5 to SM5 shader model testing, you will see those cards will perform a hell of a lot better on DX11. So we're talking about a bell-shaped plateau of optimization. UE5 can handle millions of triangles, approaching billions of triangles, hundreds of thousands of draws, but you have to pay for it up front. You have this overhead to enable via virtual shadow maps. You have this overhead to enable nanite. You have this overhead to enable SM6. But you don't need DX12 for global illumination. You don't need SM6 for global illumination. You can go back to Unreal Engine 5.3, 5.4, I think even, switch to DX11 RHI, disable virtual shadow maps, go basically only enable Lumen software ray tracing, and boom, you have global GI on DX11 that'll run on a GTX 1080, 1090, and not even break a sweat. So, and be well above 60 frames. You just have to go back to a traditional HLOD grouping setup and occlusion culling setup versus just checking a box with nanite on everything. So why that matters in mobile is because mobile Vulkan is trying to do the same thing that DX12 is doing in that regard, but it requires high memory bandwidth and better chipsets to kind of knock that optimization curve down as you throw more triangles and throw more shaders at it. But in the same regard, Vulkan eats more memory up front. It has a higher cost. It supports a higher shader subset than ES3.1 does. ES3.2 is the default in UE5, so I mean you're already paying more there. The other thing is software occlusion culling is gone. Everybody who's been working in mobile, especially on the Quest devices, understands how important software occlusion culling was to us. We could offload that cost from the GPU. The GPU wouldn't have to handle culling. It wouldn't have to handle query checks, thus freed up some of that, valuable memory and processing capacity of the device, and gave us some extra headroom. The CPU wasn't being utilized as much because physics on 4.27 was cheap. It uses PhysX and not chaos. The same can't be said in UE5. Pre-computed visibility isn't available. So these older optimization paths that these mobile chipsets and VR headsets love just are either being ripped out entirely or just aren't being supported anymore, because that's not the goal of UE5, or hasn't been the goal of UE5. Thus you have a lot of developers looking at, starting out in UE5 and going backwards, or just staying on UE4. Shout out to Behemoth. You guys are a technical marvel. There are some exceptions to the rules here. And when you work with a massive team and can, kind of overcome some of those hurdles, they're still there. I still see them. Lovely game. Love it. But I still see some of the places where, those mobile devices, really struggle. Audio cutting out. Anyone? Load optimizations there. But for what you did on that engine, bravo. Like, it's impressive and a great game. But that's beside the point. Back to the matter at hand. Chaos is heavier. And I'm not talking about simulating objects. I'm talking about like sweep checks, hit checks, anything that calls to the physics thread. You're going to see it's just heavier. They have async chaos. They've tried to fix this. I've been on UE5 for every version since 4.27, and if it was faster, I would be there. I'm a software engineer. I'm going to follow the path of least resistance. That's the way it works. So, if you're doing a smaller map and you're not having to worry about like world composition functioning properly, or landscape problems, or pre-computed visibility, or HLOD grouping working the way you expect, or light maps not chewing up more memory than they have to, then you're in a small room, or you're in PC VR, because I would make the argument that UE5 is probably good enough now to start looking at it for PC VR development. But even in that regard, like I have PC VR's games projects that run in 427 that run on a 1050 Ti and hit 90 frames per second. I mean, that's what we're talking about here. Hitting that 11 millisecond target is just easier. So I don't want to bash UE5. I love it. I really do hope that we can just look at going in that direction, and I can not have to worry about, like, you know, keeping up multiple versions of the engine for different platform targets. Like, that is the goal. But thus, that is why we're here, and I just wanted to give some context of like why we're even having I'm even like keeping a separate branch up and keeping these docs up and helping the community. Speaking of community, I want to say thanks to all of my Patreon members, everybody in the WildOx Studios Discord, everybody over at Oculus Start that gives me a hard time. Nah, I'm just playing. that makes suggestions for videos like this and like inspires me to, you know, look into problems that aren't necessarily even my own at times. One of the things that I can tell you, like if you're aspiring to be good in this ecosystem, as a developer, indie dev, AAA dev, doesn't matter. A word of advice that I can give you is that through my experience, I've learned more battling other people's problems or looking into other people's issues or helping others than I've ever learned on my path for myself. Like, so just keep that in mind. Like, whenever you're focused on something or you're working on a project, you're going to have a very narrow focus. You're going to have like a specific path that you're going to follow, and your experience is what's going to teach you what you know about that as you move through it. But if you like pay tithe, so to speak, and I know that's corny. It's Christmas Eve, but I'm just speaking on that in general. Like if you have goodwill towards the rest of your fellow man, the rest of the developing community out there, one, you're going to learn a ton by being helpful to others. Two, you're going to create good rapport with other people. And three, you never know whenever someone that's coming into this industry, because this has happened to me before, doesn't know very much right now. And I'm about to tell my age here, but 9 years later, that same person that you helped understand what a master material was, or how to instance things, or what auto instancing was and how it worked and what the rule sets behind it was, anything like that you've stepped out and you've helped, you'll never know when that same person is going to come back 8 years and help you overcome an issue. So just a little bit tidbit, food for thought. But yeah, Patreons, thank you, I love you. Discord members, thank you. And everybody over at Oculus Start for like kind of inspiring me to do this branch and bring this to a new place. Thank you as well. Merry Christmas, and if I don't talk to you guys before the New Year's over, Happy New Year. Happy developing, and toodles.